Thanks for coming along to our seminar and small panel that we're doing today. We've got three great and extremely confident speakers who are ready for your challenge presentation. But first up, I want to introduce our main speaker, Associate Professor Matthew Weingart. So Matthew is joining us from San Diego State University. He's an Erskine Fellow, so he's over here at the moment teaching into a groundwater course in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Matthew did his undergrad at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and then he did his PhD at UC Boulder. Yep. And then did a postdoc at Stanford University looking at induced seismicity. And since he's been here, he's been, as I say, teaching into one of our groundwater courses, and we've been working on some research topics as well. But he's kindly agreed to do this presentation on a really interesting undergraduate course he was telling me that he gives, which is sort of more of a historic perspective on how things have evolved in the US system, particularly out in the West, and how their water systems evolved. And I thought it might be an interesting talking point and reflection point for Canterbury, New Zealand. So over to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thank you everybody for coming today. I have to say before we get started, I've very much enjoyed, my whole family has very much enjoyed our visit to New Zealand in the Erskine Fellowship Program, and it's been very productive and enlightening to see what's going on here at University of Canterbury. Yeah, as David mentioned, this talk and actually really comes out of a little bit of what I've decided to focus on. One of the new directions that I've decided to focus my research group on at San Diego State, and it came through the development of a course. Oftentimes we learn best when we're developing our courses, and the course is entitled Water and Climate of the Desert Southwest. And as part of that course, I do sort of the atmospheric and climate interaction, ocean climate interactions in the Southwest that drive a lot of our precipitation and moisture. But I also tell the historical story of the development of water in California and also in the greater Southwest, because I think it's highly relevant to the modern day. And a lot of our students are interested in water and reading a lot of stories about drought. And so when we were talking about this, David started to get interested in what I was saying, and we sort of said, well, let's talk a little bit about the story of Southern California. So this talk focuses specifically on Los Angeles as what I consider to be one of the canonical US stories in prior appropriation water law. And quite frankly, governance failures that allowed a supply basin externality to accumulate unchecked. And the title of this talk, Draining the American West, I don't think it's rhetorical hyperbole. The Colorado River no longer reaches the sea in most years. Owens Lake, which I'll talk a little bit about, is completely dry. And Lake Mead, one of the largest reservoirs in the world, is at 25% its capacity after 2 decades of drought. So the what it means part for water everywhere, I deliberately framed it this way because I think the institutional patterns that produce the LA system are not unique to California. And I hope that there's some instruction from our story. So the first act of this talk is focused on Los Angeles. And the subtitle here is The City That Captured a River. And this goes back more than 100 years. So I'll set the stage by talking about Los Angeles and the question of water, and then go from there. So in its modern context, you see a satellite image of Southern California here. We are on the west coast of the United States. Los Angeles is in the southern part of California, right along the Pacific Ocean. This is a place with a metro population of about 13 million people. It's the second largest urban economy in the United States, with a total economic output of $1.3 trillion. Now, for comparison, Christchurch, I think the greater region is about 600,000 people. Okay, this region receives the LA region receives about 380 millimeters of rain per year. Christchurch receives about 700 millimeters of water per year. So you can imagine LA is managing roughly 30 times the population with about half the amount of precipitation you have here in Christchurch. And I put in the dollar figure, not just for context, but also as a political economic variable, right? The economic interests in receiving basins consistently typically outweigh those in source basins in any political negotiation over water allocation. And that's really an important piece of the story here. So as I said before, Los Angeles receives on average about 380 millimeters of rain per year. We consider this semi-arid. Sometimes people call it a Mediterranean climate, but there's no reliable summer rainfall. And the natural carrying capacity is far below what the modern metropolis requires. So the city, in its current extent, genuinely needs water from outside its basin in order to exist. And so the hydrological need is real. But need does not necessarily determine how the system is designed, who pays the costs, and who holds the rights. That's actually what I think, those are institutional choices. Now, to give you some context about where water is in just the state of California, this is a map of annual runoff by land area. And so California, or Los Angeles is down here in the southern part of California. I live in San Diego, the farthest southern city there. On this map, 40% of the surface area of California, mainly in the Sierra Nevada, along the eastern side of California, and the coastal ranges here in Northern California produce about 90% of the total runoff. However, about 2/3 of California's population lives in Southern California, in what we call the drier regions. This is the Mojave Desert, for reference. So we know that Sierra Nevada generate overwhelmingly the large amount of runoff, but this 40%, 90% ratio is one of the structural drivers of California's entire interbasin water system. Because essentially we have created an engineered structure to move water from where it is in its source basins to where people live and demand it. Okay, so it's not necessarily a political fact. It's a physical fact. Okay, all right. Now let's zoom in on California to talk a little bit about its history. LA first settled in maybe the mid 19th century, so we're talking about 1850s. There were probably about a couple thousand people living in Los Angeles. The Los Angeles River was the city's sole source up until about 1890. It had a mean annual discharge, and I've converted all my units into cubic meters just to make sure that we're speaking the same language. Anywhere between 50 and 80 million cubic meters a year of runoff. So it's a river that can sustain a small population, but it's certainly not going to sustain millions of people. And in dry years, the river wouldn't flow at all. So its actual annual discharge is the mean annual discharge is it's almost misleading in some sense. Flows are highly variable. One other thing I want to mention is that here's downtown LA, but the larger watershed is connected to other valleys as well. And one important valley that I'll just note here is the San Fernando Valley, okay, which is going to be part of our story in Los Angeles. Just to give you an idea of what this river, the mighty Los Angeles River, looks like. Here's the mighty Los Angeles River. The key institutional point is that the insufficiency of local supply was recognized very early, as early as the 1890s. The question was never whether to import water, but from where were they going to get it, and by whom, and under what sort of framework, and at whose expense. Okay, and in this era of the American frontier, it was sort of the Wild West. Okay, enter our central figure, William Mulholland, and maybe I can get this to go. Oh, I might have to, yeah, okay. Okay. So that's the beginning of a very nice documentary that was put together by PBS in the United States called Mulholland's Dream. It follows the story of Cadillac Desert, a book that was written by a historian on this topic. And William Mulholland is a central figure in this story. Okay, he's not primarily used as just a biographical subject, but I think he represents sort of an institutional archetype. He's sort of an engineer, but also a public administrator, and he's operating with basically total authority. He has very little accountability except to maybe a few other powerful people in Los Angeles at the time, and there are very, very limited environmental reviews. Now, he entered LA's water system as a ditch digger in 1877. Well, let me back up here. Yes, okay, thank you. Yeah, I should also mention that the subject of what I'm talking about in LA's water story was the basis of a fictionalized version of these real events in a famous movie called Chinatown. Has anyone ever seen this movie, Chinatown? Okay. It's famous in the United States, starring Jack Nicholson. Who's heard of Jack Nicholson? This is his most famous role, his most iconic role. Maybe you've seen him in other things. This launched his career. He starred as the central figure, sort of investigating what was going on. Okay. And Faye Dunaway is his counterpart. The screenwriter of this movie, Robert Towne, uh, is interviewed in this Mulholland Dream documentary, and in it he has this quote, which I think is actually quite salient. Water was power. It was money. And those who knew how to manipulate it could make money. Okay? And everything that follows is not the fictionalized version, but the real life version. Okay? All right. So William Mulholland, he was born in Ireland in 1855. He arrived in Los Angeles in 1877. He was 22 years old and he had nothing. He basically had nothing to his name. His first job was, as I said before, as a ditch digger for the Los Angeles City Water Company. Now, he was, I think, a genius. He basically self-taught himself hydraulics. He became a technical master of the entire LA water system. He could keep it all in his head all at once with no formal engineering training. And he rose very quickly to become the superintendent of the Los Angeles City Water Company, and later became the Department of Water and Power. The analytical value of Mulholland's story is that I think it illustrates what happens when engineering authority is left unconstrained by institutional checks. One of the things that Mulholland identified very quickly was that his city was growing very rapidly. Here is a table of LA County's population from 1850, as I said before, just a few thousand people, all the way up to around 1900 when he's trying to make his plans. His plans are starting to become real. 170,000 people. So we're talking huge growth just in a few decades. And by 1910, he's extrapolated out and said, we're going from 170,000 to 500,000 people. We're going to need a lot more water. Okay? We're going to need a lot more water. And he was looking not just in adjacent basins, but very, very far away. Okay? He was looking 375 kilometers to the north in a place called the Owens Valley. Okay, the Owens Valley is just denoted by this black polygon here. In 1905, the Owens Valley had about 7,000 people. There was an established agricultural economy through irrigated agriculture from the Owens River. And Owens Lake, which is at the southern terminus of the valley, okay, was then California's largest lake. The valley's hydrological system was actually a mirror image of LA's, a surplus producing basin with modest demand, governed by water rights, were legally established, but individually too small to resist a well-capitalized municipal purchaser. Now, 375 kilometers distance is operationally significant, obviously, because it's very expensive to move water. But there was a huge structural advantage. The terminus of this system is about 1,200 meters elevation. The beginning of this system would be about 1,200 meters elevation, and the terminus, I think, is just a few hundred meters. So essentially, this water could flow completely by gravity if you could tap it. And that was one of the structural reasons why Mulholland was attracted to this valley. The fact that Mulholland was confident this could even be done, I think, is central to why the project was actually politically possible. I think at this time, if you didn't have a figure like Mulholland, this project would not probably have come to pass. Now, here's a picture of Owens Valley in the wintertime right now, a specific spot. I'll show you other places in the Owens Valley later. Here's a picture of what it looked like in the early part of the 20th century, where Owens Lake there is in the background. You can see the reflection of the White Mountains there. The relief here in this place is a little bit hard to describe. You're on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevadas. Some of the tallest mountains in the United States are in the Eastern Sierra. In fact, in the continental United States, I'm going to have to speak in feet, 14,500 foot elevation, Mount Whitney. And the basin here is at about 7,500 feet. So you're talking about a 7,000 foot, I guess maybe something like 2,000 meter drop from the top of the valley or top of the mountains here to the valley floor, and another 2,000 meter rise to the mountains on the eastern side. So this is a dramatic place. It truly is a dramatic and spectacular place. All right, so Mulholland's aqueduct, the Los Angeles aqueduct, his idea is that it's going to be from the Owens River Valley down through the Mojave Desert, along the ranges down there, over the San Gabriel Mountains and into the San Fernando Valley. And once it's in the San Fernando Valley, it can be connected up to the larger natural watershed, the LA River watershed. Okay, this is his idea. He knows that there's a lot of water in this place, Owens Lake, and he has very little oversight about how he's going to do this. His idea is that he can go up to this area and start to purchase water rights. And he's going to try to do that legally. Okay, he's going to try to do that legally. Who is he going to work with in planning out this endeavor? Two other very important figures in this drama. Fred Eaton, who is the former LA mayor there in the middle. Mulholland is on the right. And then the third figure is Joseph Lippincott there on the left. He's the chief engineer of an engineer working on a federal project within the Owens Valley to build more irrigation for the farmers that live in that region. Okay. Now, why it's important that these three people are working together is that you have the head of the Department of Water and Power, Mulholland. You have the mayor, who is politically connected to the elite of the city. And you have the engineer for the Owens Valley project, the federal project, and intimate knowledge of the water rights in this region. Okay. Now, one of the advantages of having this engineer who knows a lot about the water rights in this region of the Owens Valley is that he can simultaneously be working for the federal government trying to survey for an irrigation project and also serve as a consultant on a secret plan to take these water rights for the city of Los Angeles. So he was working directly with Fred Eaton and with William Mulholland on picking out and designing which water rights should be bought, which were more valuable than others, in order to capture this river for the city of Los Angeles. I should also mention that there were indigenous people living in this valley for thousands of years, well before farmers were working with irrigated agriculture. There was a water-based culture, the Owens Valley Paiute. They manage the landscape with extensive irrigation ditches, and actually they're often cited as North America's most sophisticated pre-European water management. During none of these negotiations were they a party to or compensated for the loss of their water. And actually, much of the disagreements between the indigenous community there and the agricultural community there were already occurring and had already occurred as Mulholland was entering the scene. Essentially, the farmers in this region were pushing the Paiute further up the valley to the less productive agricultural regions already, and essentially fencing off the productive areas. Okay, let's go back to our story. Now, we have the three important figures: the Joseph Lippincott, the engineer for the federal project up in the Owens Valley; Fred Eaton, the former mayor; and Mulholland himself. But this project doesn't get done without money. They can know exactly what water rights they want to buy. They can have an idea about how to build an aqueduct and where to build an aqueduct, but they're going to need some money to do this. And in order to do that, they're going to have to sell this story to the public. And what story they're going to sell to the public is fear, water-related fear, that in order for our city to grow and to not have supply constraint, we're going to need more water, and you're going to need to foot the bill. So as part of that story, the owner of what was then called the Los Angeles Daily Times, now the Los Angeles Times, was in on the deal. Okay, they brought him in. Okay, and they started writing op-ed after op-ed, story after story about the issues related to water. In fact, this is a story from 1905. Titanic project to give city a river, 30,000 inches of water to be brought to Los Angeles, options secured on 40 miles of river frontage in Inyo County, magnificent stream to be conveyed down to the Southland in conduit 240 miles long, stupendous deal closed. Okay. All right. But they were going to need to have a bond vote. They were going to need to vote on a municipal bond to fund all of this. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this group of people who were involved in driving for this Mulholland's vision. There's a little excerpt from a news clipping that I found that talked a lot about how the fear of this drought and the fear of lack of water was actually artificially stimulated by a group of wealthy people at the time. In 1905 and later in 1910, we'll call them the Syndicate. These are all very wealthy people in LA at this time. Harry Chandler, I believe, he is involved with the newspaper. General Harrison Gray Otis. Henry Huntington is a railroad magnate, also oil person. M.H. Sherman. These people realized, hey, all this land that outside of the current city's boundaries, which at that time was San Fernando Valley, but within the footprint of the watershed and within the footprint of where the irrigation water was going to be brought, they realized that this land was right now not very valuable, but if there were water, it would be irrigated and therefore very valuable. And they came up with this idea. Basically, if we can fulfill Mulholland's vision to bring water from the Owens Valley, this land will become much more valuable. And so this group of folks had a vested interest once they had bought this land on the cheap, to actually drive forward this plan. And interestingly, a side note to this, and this is not oftentimes very well covered, is that there was a competing newspaper in Los Angeles at the time. It was called the Los Angeles Examiner, and it was owned by William Hearst. Has anyone ever heard of William Hearst? Hearst Castle. He was the main subject of the movie Citizen Kane. Okay, wealthy guy. He's reading all these news stories about water drought and all this stuff, and he starts to realize that there's probably something going on at the LA Times, that the owner of the LA Times or someone close to the ownership group is running these stories for a purpose. And he actually hires a group of private investigators to go to the City Hall of Records, and he figures out they have a list of who's bought all this property. And they uncover this syndicate, basically, and they start writing news stories. We'll make millions by new water plant. Los Angeles capitalists and the San Fernando Land Company to profit if Owens River is tapped, because they know where the aqueduct is going, right? A pretty clear and transparent story by modern standards, I think. Okay, so let's fast forward. They've passed this bond. The money's there. They've got the water rights. Now they're going to build this aqueduct. And it had never been done before on this sort of scale. This was the first of its kind. It's truly a genuinely remarkable engineering feat. 375 kilometers across the Mojave Desert, 142 tunnels. It was completed in 5 years at a cost of around, I think in those dollars, $25 million. Today, dollars about $800 million. It was completed under budget and significantly ahead of schedule. This gravity feed design was Mulholland's most significant technical achievement because there was no need to pump water anywhere on the system. He had very carefully graded the whole graded and surveyed the whole route, and he eliminated huge costs related to pumping. Okay. I'll also note that 5,000 workers were working on this aqueduct at peak construction. They were housed in camps along the aqueduct's route that was predominantly built with immigrant labor. And there were minimal safety protections, no long-term employment guarantees, and there was a lot of turnover because Mojave Desert, it can be 50 degrees C in the daytime and nearly freezing at night. It's a very harsh environment to be working in day and night. Okay, so by 1913, specifically November 5th, 1913, they have completed this aqueduct. And it is lauded in the local newspaper, Los Angeles Times. Glorious mountain river now flows to Los Angeles gates. I think from this date forward, the city of Los Angeles growth trajectory was basically formally decoupled from its local water budget. The LA River's carrying capacity became irrelevant to water planning, to urban planning. And the question was simply how much Owens Valley water was available, not whether local supply was adequate. I also think this date marks the point at which costs already incurred in the Owens Valley became politically irreversible. This constituency of people that are in LA that are witnesses to this opening, they're actually now invested in this system, right? They've created a political lock-in that made the rollback of this whole system unthinkable because of how the acquisition had been conducted. Mulholland stood in front of this group of about 30 or 40,000 onlookers. A significant chunk of the city was actually there on the day that the aqueduct opened. And he was recorded as giving, I think, what's known as the shortest speech at one of these sort of openings ever given. He unfurled an American flag and he just said, "There it is, take it." And I think it sort of encapsulates the whole story in 4 words. The worldview embedded in this statement is the basic doctrine of this time of prior appropriation. Basically, water in a stream is not necessarily a common resource to be shared, but essentially an unclaimed asset to be captured by the first person that can capture it, right? Okay. This is that photo zoomed in of onlookers as the river opened, and actually people brought their tin cups so that they could go. I don't know what I did there. They brought their tin cups to go actually grab a scoop of the LA aqueduct. Okay. One other thing I want to mention is that this infrastructure, because of how difficult it is and expensive it is to build, I think it defines what is possible, something, a true engineering feat, but also politically acceptable for the long run, for generations to come. And this sort of started a whole raft of projects. People were thinking just like Mulholland. He influenced a whole generation of engineers, of water engineers, to think about this, regardless of whether the original allocation decision was sound for many of the reasons that we talked about before. By 1922, 95% of the Owens River water was owned by the city of Los Angeles. These are the actual water rights ownership maps, and yellow is designated as Los Angeles controlled in the valley. Here's a picture of that same inlet or outlet at the San Fernando Valley. You can see this today. This is a modern picture, not very far off Highway 5, which runs the length of California. This first aqueduct in 1913 brought 370 million cubic meters a year of water, way more water than Los Angeles thought it could ever use in the next decade or two. But believe me, very quickly they realized they were going to need a lot more water because their population grew very, very fast. I'll only briefly mention it now, but they actually built a second aqueduct completed in 1970 that nearly doubled the capacity, bringing water from the Owens River Valley. Now, in the immediate aftermath, Los Angeles blossomed. There was more water than they knew what to do with. The palm trees, many people know on Rodeo Drive in Beverly's Hills, Owens River Valley water. Huntington Gardens in Pasadena, this sort of opulent, beautiful garden, Owens River Valley water. And population growth. In the 2 decades following, 2.2 million people living in Los Angeles by 1930. Now, the aftermath for Owens Lake, not so rosy. Owens Lake in 1900, surveyed by the US Geological Survey. Owens Lake, more or less today, a Google Earth satellite image. Complete desiccation of this lake was achieved only 13 years after the opening of the first aqueduct, 1926. And it became an alkaline playa where particulate matter, particularly harmful particulate matter, is going to be breathed in by the people who live in this region. The Department of Water and Power has spent nearly $2 billion, $2.5 billion on dust suppression alone in the last 25 years in this region, about $30 million a year. I'll show you a picture of that in here in a second. Here's what it looks like today. They build basically berms to control different parts of the dust. What about for Mulholland? Well, in the immediate aftermath, Mulholland is a hero in the city. They want him to run for mayor. He doesn't want to. He wants to run the Department of Water and Power. And for about a decade or more after 1913, he's a hero in the city. They name a famous road on top of the hills, Mulholland Drive, where the Hollywood sign is. They name it Mulholland Drive. There's a Mulholland Reservoir. There's a Mulholland School. But it doesn't end so rosy for Mulholland, because in 1928, a dam on the LA aqueduct system, known as the St. Francis Dam, collapses overnight in the middle of the night. 200 people die in this dam failure. And he resigns as the head of the Department of Water and Power, not just a few days later. And he sort of spends the rest of his life, I think he lives for about a decade more, in sort of anonymity and shame. It was his greatest failure. All right. That's the story of LA Water. And that's the starting point for the whole raft of development over the next 100 years or so in the Southwest. I'll argue that the same institutional logic that drove the Owens Valley acquisition is present in the Colorado River story. Over allocation relative to sustainable yield, infrastructure lock-in, governance that responds to crisis rather than preventing it. The Colorado River is the Owens Valley story on steroids. It's a much, much larger scale. And the potential effects could be felt by up to 40 million people and millions of acres of agricultural land. One point I'd like to make is that the machine outlasted the man. The machine outlasted the man. LA's population growth started to go exponential after the aqueduct opened. By 1930, 2.2 million. By 1960, 4 million. The Owens Valley supply at full capacity couldn't keep pace with the growth. They needed another source. And they were going to create a new entity called the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California in the late 1920s to start planning for that next allocation. And that next allocation was going to be 390 kilometers to the east and the Colorado River, specifically the Colorado River Aqueduct. So he set in motion this whole engineering infrastructure that lasted for more than a century after him. The present day system in California, it's astounding. It's billions upon billions of dollars, years and years and years of labor to build this interbasin transfer system. The LA Aqueduct is just one component of this larger system. We have the Colorado River Aqueduct bringing water from the Colorado River, the border with Arizona. We have the All-American Canal also bringing water from the Colorado River, but to another area. We have the California Aqueduct, which is a state project bringing water from the northern parts of California, Lake Oroville, Shasta, down to the Delta, and down into the agricultural areas of the Southern Central Valley, and also into LA. And the Metropolitan Water District service area, which includes San Diego, by the way, is a very powerful entity in the water distribution system of California. And you have to understand, this water supports a $1.5 trillion economy. It's not just agriculture, it's also the urban users, right? And all the folks that are doing amazing and creative things in the various cities in Southern California. So let's back up and talk a little bit about the Colorado River and its history and development. I'm going to zoom out here and talk about the whole basin as a whole, much bigger basin than the Owens River or Valley or Los Angeles. We're talking about one of the largest, it is the largest water source in the Southwest. And there have been ad nauseum number of projects diverting water from the basin's boundaries. So this black polygon is the rough basin boundary. In these little hatched areas outside of the basin boundaries are all these various major projects to pump water take water from the basin and move it out to the urban areas surrounding the basin. Salt Lake City, Denver, Albuquerque, Los Angeles, San Diego, all places outside the boundaries of this system that are taking the vast majority of its water or using the vast majority of its water. Phoenix, Tucson, these places are within its boundaries, but also big users. And like I said before, 40 million people irrigating 2.2 million hectares of farmland. Now, its drainage area is large, 630,000 square kilometers. Its long-term annual flow, 18 cubic kilometers per year. It is one of the most over-allocated systems in the world. The river no longer reaches its natural outlet anymore, which is down here in the Gulf of California. In fact, there's also Mexico who receives water from the Colorado River. Because flow at the international boundary has been effectively zero since the 1960s, since we built major dams on this river and reservoirs. The hydrology of the river is interestingly somewhat similar in some ways to California, in the sense that the states that make up what we call the upper basin states, basically north of the border between Utah and Arizona, supply most of the recharge for this system because it's primarily driven by snowmelt off the Rocky Mountains and the Uinta Mountains in Colorado and Utah and Wyoming. A majority of the Colorado River's drainage basin is either arid or semi-arid, receiving less than 400 millimeters of water per year. Now, this system was allocated in the year 1922, which is about a little more than 100 years now. And the way it was allocated was they broke out the different components of the basin from upper basin to lower basin. And there are two key reservoirs on this system I'll mention in a second. But I just want you to focus on how they partitioned the amounts of water between the various basins. California, which I apologize, this is in a weird unit we haven't talked about, but it's about 5 cubic kilometers of water. So about roughly a third of the flow of the Colorado River goes to California. And California's contribution to this river in terms of its watershed is very small. Now, why does California have both the largest share and actually what we call the senior water right on this system? Well, it's because this area was very well aware in 1922 what it takes to create a city in a place where there's not a huge water supply. They were very well aware that they were going to need Colorado River water as early as the early 1920s. Mulholland may have even been involved in some of the negotiations, or at least advising some of the negotiations related to the apportionments on the Colorado River. The upper basin states, you'll note here, they break things down on a percentage basis, not by raw numbers. That actually matters because the way that the water supply works in this region is, let's say the annual flow in a year on the Colorado River is 4.4 million acre feet, 5 cubic kilometers. California will get 5 cubic kilometers and everybody else will get 0. That's how the system works, at least by the standards of 1922. The two major infrastructure projects that made this compact viable and made this river, I think, a long-term source were built in the 1930s and 1960s. The Hoover Dam, and behind it, the reservoir, Lake Mead, 35 billion cubic meters of storage, at the time, the largest dam ever built. And then later, Glen Canyon Dam, further upstream, right at that key point, which I had circled with a red circle, Lake Powell, with a reservoir storage of 31 billion cubic meters. One important thing that these reservoirs do is not only store water, but also generate hydroelectric power. probably even more importantly on an annual basis, is that this water basically keeps the lights on in many of the cities of the Southwest. Now, I briefly mentioned at the very beginning of this talk that this system is in crisis. It's a 25-year drought since the year 2000. Here's a story from 2022 from CNN. Lake Powell is about to drop below a critical level never reached before as drought rages on. And you can see the bathtub rings of where the reservoir level used to be. And critically, Lake Mead's water storage is very, very low. It reached as low as 25% capacity in 2022. Hoover Dam would no longer generate electrical power if the capacity drops to 15%. Basically, the water level would be below the turbines and they wouldn't be able to keep the lights on. So they knew that there was this long-term drought. The various states and users, and also the federal government, have always been hoping that there would just be a really good couple of years and the reservoirs would fill right back up. But it's been one of the longest droughts we've ever seen on the Colorado River. And therefore, it required a plan. What was known as, at the time, as the Drought Contingency Plan. This is a little bit of a hard graphic to understand, but on the y-axis, it's the elevation of the reservoir, Lake Mead. And then as it drops, the proposed amount that each state will cut in volume. Now, this was signed in 2019, and it was one of the first ever, after a smaller plan in 2007, of some sort of agreement between the states on how to actually cut their water use if there's a drought. And essentially, the federal government forced the states to do this. They didn't want to do this, but they were forced to by the federal government because of the mandates the federal government had with the hydroelectric power. It's also a completely voluntary agreement. There's no mandatory enforcement of this agreement. It's a completely voluntary agreement, and it was only going to be in effect for 5 years, starting in 2020 and unfortunately ending in 2025. And they're currently renegotiating this plan, hopefully a much more long-term future. One interesting thing about this drought contingency plan is the question of who blinks first and the politics of actually cutting. It's such a cutthroat game. Now, Arizona has the junior water right on the Colorado River, meaning it gets water last. And it's also the first to cut in a drought. And by 2021 and 2022, I mentioned that the reservoirs were really low. This plan went into effect. Here's Ian James writing for the Arizona Republic. Southwest braces for water cutbacks as drought deepens along the Colorado River. So Arizona started to actually cut. They agreed to it, and they actually met their demands. And interestingly, they knew that these cuts were probably coming, and they said that they'd been planning for these cuts for a very long time. Who got cut? It was the agricultural water users in Arizona, the rural areas where they were growing crops. They were some of the largest water users, but they also were the first to see cuts. And the Department of Water Resources told the agricultural users, don't worry, just pump more groundwater. We'll get through these few years and then we'll figure it out. Basically, they actually told them, we're going to give you money to drill more groundwater wells so you can pump more groundwater. But that's a whole other story for another time. All right. So I hope one thing that came through with the Colorado River section is that under these new supply restrictions, agricultural users, specifically in these places in the West, are under a huge amount of pressure. The politicians in these regions are very sensitive to the urban users because there's, quite frankly, more money, there's more people, more votes in the urban areas, and they want to support expansion and development of the suburban areas first over any agricultural users at this point. And this was a long time coming. Here is a supply and demand curve for the Colorado River in blue, supply, demand in orange. Interestingly, this drought hit at the very time when supply and demand hit each other. And for the last 20 or so years, demand has been running right along with supply, outpacing it in some way in a lot of places. And that's why we've seen the storage of the reservoirs come down. So I think there is a pattern to both the story of the LA Aqueduct and the Owens Valley and the story of the Colorado River. I think overexploited water systems in the world have followed this pattern pretty consistently. The first is abundance. They bring the LA Aqueduct to LA. Water appears limitless. Development races ahead of understanding. This commitment of building the aqueduct locks in the infrastructure and the political constituencies, right, to defend it. Then there's a crisis because hydrology reasserts itself. Shortages emerge, conflicts begin. And then there's this process of renegotiation that's usually politically painful and in some cases too late for ecosystems and communities. I think that was true for the LA system, LA story, and the Owens Valley. I think we're right here in the Colorado River story right now. And so with that, I want to